Abigail Whittaker pressed the pen so hard against the paper that her fingers went white, and still she could not make herself sign. "Mr. Callahan is waiting," the banker said, his smile never reaching his eyes. Her father reached over and gently closed her hand around the pen. That was the moment she understood no one was going to save her. Not her father, not the law, not God. The ink touched paper, and Abigail Whittaker ceased to exist. In her place stood Mrs. Rhett Callahan, wife to the most feared man in Colorado Territory. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow every part until the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The courthouse in Durango smelled like dust and old decisions, the kind of decisions that men made about women without ever asking them first. Abigail had worn her mother's dress. It was the only good thing left after the creditors came through the house like a slow flood, taking the furniture, the silver, the portraits off the walls. They'd left the dress because it had no resale value. Too worn at the cuffs, a small stain near the hem that no amount of soaking ever lifted. She told herself she wore it because it was the only option. She knew somewhere deeper than she wanted to admit that she wore it because she needed her mother close to her today. Her father, Gerald Whittaker, stood 2 feet to her left and might as well have been standing in another county. He hadn't looked at her directly since breakfast. He looked at the floorboards, at the window, at his own hands. He looked at everything in that room except his daughter's face. "You understand what today means," he had told her that morning, standing in the doorway of her room while she pinned her hair in the cracked mirror. It wasn't a question. "I understand," she said. "The bank holds the note on everything, the land, the cattle, the house. If Callahan doesn't—" I said, "I understand, Papa." He'd gone quiet then, and quiet was the most honest thing Gerald Whittaker had said to her in months. The man seated across the long wooden table had not spoken a single word since Abigail entered the room. Rhett Callahan. She'd heard the name her entire life the way children hear stories about storms, as something distant and powerful and best avoided. The ranchers in town said he'd driven 3 men off their homesteads at gunpoint. The women at the dry goods store said his first wife had left in the middle of the night and never sent word. The sheriff, old Deputy Crane, who'd held the badge for 20 years, said only this when her father's lawyer first floated the arrangement. "Gerald, I hope you know what you're putting that girl into." And yet, Rhett Callahan, seen in person, was not what the stories had built. He was large, that part was true. Broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that came from 20 years of actual labor, not management. His face was weathered in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with weather. A scar ran along his left jaw, thin and old, the kind that had long since stopped mattering to the man who wore it. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a hard 35, and he was watching her with an expression she could not name. Not hunger, not satisfaction, not the look of a man who had purchased something and was pleased with the transaction. He looked, if she was being precise about it, like a man who was bracing for something. Edgar Whitmore, the banker, spread the papers across the table with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times before. He was everything Rhett Callahan was not, pressed and polished his suit without a wrinkle. His mustache perfectly trimmed, his smile, the kind that lived only on the surface of a face, without ever going deeper. "Simple enough arrangement," Whitmore said pleasantly. "The Whittaker debt transfers to the Callahan account upon legal marriage. Gerald retains the house and 2 acres. The ranch land consolidates under Callahan Holdings." He tapped the papers. "Standard terms. Very generous, I'd say." Abigail looked at her father. Gerald Whittaker's jaw moved slightly, like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. "Papa," she said quietly, "look at me." He didn't. "Papa." He looked at the window. Something in Abigail's chest closed like a fist. She turned back to the papers. She picked up the pen, and she heard her own voice come out of her mouth steadier than she had any right to expect. "What are the terms regarding the marriage itself? Mr. Whitmore, the living arrangements, The expectations. Whitmore blinked. He hadn't anticipated the question. Men like Whitmore rarely anticipated women asking precise questions. "That's between you and Mr. Callahan," he said smoothly. She turned to Rhett Callahan directly. "Then I'm asking Mr. Callahan." The room went very still. Rhett Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not irritation. Something more careful than that. "You'll have your own room," he said. His voice was low and rougher than she expected, like gravel under boot leather. "Your own key. I won't come into it without your permission, ever. And if I want to leave—" Another pause, shorter this time. "Then you leave. Just like that." "Just like that," he said. "I'm not in the business of keeping people who don't want to be kept." Whitmore laughed, a small dismissive sound. "Poetic. Shall we proceed?" Abigail signed the paper. The wagon ride to Callahan Ranch took 2.5 hours, and Rhett Callahan spent all of it driving the team and saying nothing. Abigail sat beside him on the bench and stared at the land rolling out ahead of them. Colorado in September was a complicated kind of beautiful, the aspens turning gold against the dark pine ridges, the sky so blue it almost hurt to look at the air carrying that first cold edge that told you winter was already thinking about arriving. She had brought one trunk. Everything she owned now fit in one trunk. She thought about that for a while, and then she stopped thinking about it because it didn't help anything. "How many people work the ranch?" she asked, somewhere past the first hour. Rhett glanced at her sideways, like he hadn't expected her to speak. 14 regular hands," he said. 2 more in calving season. "And they've been with you long?" "Most of them, 7-8 years. "Men don't stay that long for bad wages," she said. He looked at her again, longer this time. "No," he said. "They don't." Silence settled back between them, but it was a slightly different kind of silence than before. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out before caution could stop it. "What did you expect? Honestly, I wouldn't have asked otherwise." She considered. Someone who looked pleased with himself. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. "The arrangement wasn't my idea," he said. She turned to look at him directly. "Whose was it?" His jaw tightened. "Whitmore brought it to me. Said your family needed relief and I needed—" He stopped. "Needed what?" He was quiet for a moment. "He said I needed someone who could manage a household, run things properly. He made it sound like a practical arrangement for both sides. And you agreed." "I said I'd meet you first." Abigail looked away. Something about that bothered her more than the arrangement itself, and she couldn't immediately explain why. Then she could. It meant he'd had the option to refuse. He'd met her and chosen to proceed anyway. She didn't know whether to be insulted or grateful. "Why?" she asked. He didn't answer for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to. "Because Whitmore was very eager for me to say no," he said at last. The ranch was not what the Stories had built either. She had expected something austere, something that matched the reputation: iron fences and locked gates and men with hard faces who didn't make eye contact. She had expected a place that looked the way Fear felt. The Callahan Ranch was orderly. That was the first word that came to her. Not cold, not brutal. Orderly in the way that things were orderly when someone cared about them. The fences straight and well-maintained, the yard swept, the outbuildings solid and well-built. The horses in the paddock nearest the road were sleek and even-tempered, lifting their heads at the wagon's approach without shying. A man came out of the barn as they pulled in, lean 60s, with a face so creased it looked like a topographic map of somewhere very dry. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, and there was nothing ironic in the way he said it. He reached up and took her hand to help her down from the wagon before Rhett had even set the brake. "Name's Hector Gaines. I run the day-to-day out here. Anything you need, you come find me." She looked at Rhett. He was already unhitching the team, his back to them. "Thank you, Mr. Gaines," she said. "Hector," he corrected. "Around here, we don't stand on formality much." He carried her trunk inside himself without being asked, without making a production of it. The inside of the house was clean. Not the deep-cleaned precision of a woman's touch. Things were plain and functional, but it was not dirty, not neglected. The floors were swept. The windows had glass in them. The kitchen had a cast-iron stove that looked newer than anything else in the room. Her room was at the end of the upstairs hall. The key was in the lock on the inside. She stood there looking at it for a long time after Hector set her trunk down and left. The key was in the lock on the inside. Rhett Callahan had told her the truth. She didn't sleep the first night. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her. The creak of the house, the distant sound of one of the horses shifting in the paddock, the wind working its way under the eaves. She counted the ways she was trapped and the ways she was not. Trapped, married to a man she didn't know. No money of her own. No family nearby. No place to go back to. Not trapped key on the inside of the door. Hands who didn't look at her with suspicion. A kitchen she had access to. A man who had so far done exactly what he said he would do. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd expected when she walked into that courthouse. She was still turning it over when she heard the sound. Downstairs. The kitchen. Movement, then the low sound of something being set down heavily. She lay still and told herself it was nothing. The sound came again. Abigail got up, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and went to the door. She turned the key, opened it, stood at the top of the stairs, and listened. She went down. Rhett was at the kitchen table with a candle and a ledger open in front of him, a cup of coffee growing cold at his elbow. He looked up when she came in, and the surprise on his face was genuine. "I heard something," she said by way of explanation. "I put the coffee pot down too hard," he said. "Didn't mean to wake you." She looked at the ledger, at the lines of numbers written in a careful, deliberate hand. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Rarely can," he said. She stood there. He looked at her. Neither of them moved. "I'll go back up," she said. "You don't have to," he said. Then immediately, like he'd said something wrong. "I mean, the kitchen's yours too, if you want coffee." She crossed the room, took a cup from the shelf, poured what was left in the pot. She sat down across from him, not beside him, across, a full table's width between them. He looked at her with that expression again, the one she'd seen in the courthouse, bracing. "You're working the books at 2 a.m, she said. "The spring numbers came in wrong. I've been trying to find where." She looked at the ledger. She'd spent 3 years managing her father's accounts before the creditors made it a meaningless exercise. "May I?" He looked at her. "The ledger," she said. "May I look?" He turned it around and slid it across the table. She found the error in 4 minutes. A transposition in the feed costs column 2 digits switched that had thrown off 6 subsequent calculations. She pointed to it. Rhett leaned forward and looked at where her finger was. Then he sat back in his chair. 3 weeks, he said quietly. "What?" "I've been going over that for 3 weeks." She slid the ledger back to him. "Fresh eyes," she said. He looked at her across the candlelight. And for the first time since the courthouse, something in his expression shifted from bracing to something she didn't have a word for yet. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, finished her coffee. "Good night, Mr. Callahan." "Rhett," he said. "Around here we don't stand on formality much." She didn't smile, but she came very close. The town of Durango had opinions. It always had opinions. That was the primary industry of small towns in Colorado Territory. The production and distribution of opinions about other people's business. And the marriage of the Whitaker girl to Rhett Callahan was the kind of story that could fuel opinions for months. Abigail discovered this on her first trip into town 6 days after the wedding. She went alone. She'd asked Rhett if she could take the smaller wagon, and he'd looked at her in that considering way of his and said, "It's your wagon too," which she was beginning to understand was his version of yes. At the dry goods store, Mrs. Harlan Briggs, wife of the feed store owner, self-appointed chronicler of Durango's social order, stopped sorting bolts of fabric and looked at Abigail with the expression of someone who had just received a gift they hadn't expected. "Mrs. Callahan," she said. "My goodness, you look well." "Thank you, Mrs. Briggs." "We were all so worried naturally when we heard, well, you know how people talk." "I do," Abigail said. She placed her list on the counter and waited for the store clerk to start pulling items. "And he's treating you suitably. You can be honest with me, dear. We're all friends here." Abigail looked at Mrs. Briggs steadily. "My husband is treating me with complete respect," she said. "Thank you for your concern." Mrs. Briggs leaned slightly closer. "Well, that's reassuring. Some of us had wondered, given the situation with poor Sylvia." "I'm not familiar with that situation," Abigail said, "and I'm not sure it's mine to be familiar with." The clerk set her items on the counter. Abigail paid and loaded them into her basket and said goodbye to Mrs. Briggs, who was already repositioning herself to speak to the woman who'd come in behind Abigail. Outside, she stood by the wagon and let herself breathe. Poor Sylvia. The first wife no one spoke of directly. The woman who'd left in the night. She hadn't asked Rhett about her. She hadn't asked Rhett much of anything yet. They were still at the stage of careful distance, polite at meals, occasional exchanges in the evening, the shared understanding that they were two strangers who happened to be sleeping under the same roof and were for now managing not to be an inconvenience to each other. She thought about the ledger, about the key in the lock. She thought, there's something wrong with the story this town is telling. Matarag. She found out about Sylvia not from Rhett, but from Hector Gaines on a morning when she brought coffee out to the men working on a broken section of fence near the north pasture. It wasn't something she planned. She was walking back toward the house, and Hector fell into step beside her, and somehow the conversation turned the way conversations sometimes do, finding their own current, and he said almost casually, "You're handling this better than most would." "What makes you say that?" she asked. Hector was quiet for a moment. "Sylvia lasted 3 weeks," he said. "Couldn't take the quiet. Couldn't take the stories the town told. She'd come out here expecting a monster, and when she found out he wasn't one, it didn't fit with what she'd already decided, so she left." Abigail stopped walking. She left because he wasn't a monster. Easier to be afraid of something you understand than confused by something you don't. Hector shrugged. Rhett never blamed her. Helped her get to her sister's place in Denver. Paid the cost of it. Never said a word against her in town, even when she said plenty against him. He glanced at Abigail sideways. "That's the kind of man he is, in case it's useful to you." She stood there in the yard and looked at the house that was clean, the horses that were calm, the hands that stayed year after year. She thought about Edgar Whitmore and his pressed suit and his surface smile and the very precise way he'd managed the paperwork in that courthouse. The way he'd laughed when Rhett said he didn't keep people who didn't want to be kept. Because Whitmore was very eager for me to say no. "Hector," she said, "how long has Whitmore's bank held paper on properties in this county?" Hector looked at her with an expression of cautious reassessment. "Since about 72, he said slowly. "Why? How many ranches has he foreclosed on in that time?" A pause. "A fair number." "And how many of those properties ended up consolidated or absorbed?" Hector stopped walking entirely. He looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Callahan," he said carefully. "Abigail." "Abigail." He looked toward the house, then back at her. "That's a question I think you ought to ask Rhett." "Hank." She asked him that night. They were in the kitchen again. It had become, without either of them deciding it, the place where they talked. The table between them, the candle, the coffee. The hour late enough that the day's distance had worn down slightly. "Tell me about Edgar Whitmore," she said. Rhett's hands went still around his cup. "What do you want to know?" he said after a moment. Silence that followed was long enough that she thought he might refuse. But she'd been watching him for 2 weeks now, and she was beginning to understand the difference between his silences. Some were walls. Some were just men gathering themselves. This one was the second kind. "My father built this ranch," he said at last. 30 years. Started with nothing and built something real. Whitmore came in around 73 when beef prices dropped. Offered a loan at terms that looked reasonable. Then he changed the terms. The language in the original contract had a clause buried in the back on the second-to-last page in type small enough to need a magnifying glass that allowed him to adjust the interest rate annually based on market conditions. He looked at the table. When beef prices dropped, Whitmore raised the interest rate, called it market conditions. The rate more than doubled in 2 years. My father couldn't service the debt. Whitmore was 6 weeks from taking the whole property when my father's heart gave out. His voice had not changed in pitch or volume. It remained level and controlled throughout. That she was learning was how Rhett Callahan carried things that hurt him not with heat, but with a kind of rigid, quiet containment. "I was 22, he said. "I found the clause in the contract myself, took it to a lawyer in Denver. He said it was legal barely, said the only remedy was to pay the debt in full or find someone with more legal resources to challenge it." "And did you?" "I paid the debt. Took me 4 years of work I won't describe to you in detail. And when it was done, and I owned this ranch free of Whitmore's paper, he smiled at me like I'd done him a favor." Abigail felt something cold move through her. "What kind of favor?" she said. Rhett looked at her. He'd spent 4 years telling the county that he was the reasonable creditor and I was the problem. That my father had been reckless and I was worse. By the time I'd cleared the debt, the story was already set. I had the ranch. I didn't have the reputation. She looked at him across the table. "And then he brought you this arrangement," she said slowly. "Yes, with a woman from a bankrupt family. A woman who had no choice and no resources, and would be grateful enough to accept whatever she was offered." Rhett met her eyes directly. "That's what I think," he said. "Yes." "Why, what does he gain from you having a wife?" His jaw tightened. "He doesn't want me to have a wife. He wants me to be the kind of man the county believes I am. A man like that, someone with no real connections, no one who vouches for him, is vulnerable in ways that matter. Legally, socially." He paused. "He expected me to refuse, or he expected you to be what he'd told everyone you were," Abigail said. "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. "Then we've made a mess of his plan," she said. Rhett looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. She still didn't have the full vocabulary for what moved across his face in these moments. But it wasn't the bracing look. It was something more exposed than that. "Seems like we have," he said. The candle between them had burned down by more than half. Outside, the wind was picking up. Abigail looked at her hands flat on the table. Then she looked at him. "I want to see every piece of paper you have on the bank," she said. "Every contract, every letter, every communication. And I want to know who else in this county Whitmore has done this to. Because I don't think my family was the last." Rhett Callahan looked at her like she'd said something that surprised him. Not alarmed him. Not unsettled him. Surprised him. "That's going to take a while," he said. "Then we'd better start tonight," she said. And for the first time since she'd walked into that courthouse in her mother's dress, Abigail Whitaker, Mrs. Callahan. She supposed, though the name still sat oddly, felt something other than surrender. She felt the specific, purposeful calm of a woman who has found the shape of the fight. The papers were spread across the kitchen table by midnight, and by 2 in the morning, Abigail had stopped counting the ways Edgar Whitmore had broken the law. Not because there were too few, because there were too many. Rhett had brought 3 wooden boxes down from the shelf in his study boxes she hadn't known existed, hadn't known to ask about, and set them on the table without ceremony. "Everything I kept," he said. "Every letter, every contract, every notice he ever sent my father, and then me. I kept it all because my father told me to. Said a man like Whitmore always leaves a paper trail because he's too confident to cover it." Abigail pulled the first box toward her and started reading. Gerald Whitaker's loan documents were in the second box. She found them 40 minutes in, tucked between a letter from Whitmore's attorney and a surveyor's map she didn't yet understand. She recognized her father's signature at the bottom, that familiar cramped scrawl, the signature of a man who'd never entirely trusted his own handwriting. She put the papers down, picked them back up, read the interest clause 3 times. He used the same language, she said. Rhett looked up from the letter he was reading. What? The clause, the adjustable rate clause, the exact same phrasing word for word. She set the papers side by side, her father's contract and a copy of the one from Rhett's father that Rhett had made himself years ago in a lawyer's office in Denver. He didn't even change the wording, he used a template. Rhett was out of his chair and beside her before she'd finished the sentence. He leaned over the table and read both documents, his finger moving along the lines. Then he straightened. If he used it on both our families, he said slowly. Then he used it on others, Abigail said. This isn't improvised. This is a system. They looked at each other across the papers. How many ranches has he foreclosed on since 1872? She asked, though she already knew Hector had said a fair number, and a fair number in Hector Gaines's careful speech meant more than people wanted to acknowledge. I know of at least 7, Rhett said. Maybe more that I don't know about directly. I need to see those names, she said. And I need to know where those people went. Rhett looked at her for a moment. Not the bracing look, not the careful, measuring look either. Something more direct than both. You're building a case, he said. Someone needs to. Abigail. He said her name with a weight she hadn't heard in it before. Whitmore has the county judge in his pocket, half the town council too. Even if we found every person he's done this to, even if we assembled everything, a local court won't touch him. Then we don't go to a local court, she said. He stared at her. There's a federal land claims office in Denver, she said. I read about it in the Territorial Digest last spring when my father was first struggling. Federal jurisdiction overrides county appointments, and if the fraud involves land, which it does, it falls under their authority. You read the Territorial Digest, he said. Not a question, just the particular tone of a man recalibrating. My father had a subscription. He stopped reading it when the trouble started. I didn't. Rhett sat back down slowly. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. If we go to Denver, he said carefully, Whitmore will know. He has people who watch the stage lines, probably the telegraph office too. Then we don't telegraph first, she said. We go in person, quietly. You're talking about leaving the ranch. I'm talking about fighting back. Another silence. Outside, the wind that had picked up earlier had settled into a steady pressure against the house, the kind of wind that in Colorado meant weather coming. My father tried to fight him, Rhett said, quietly, through proper channels. And Whitmore turned his reputation against him so thoroughly that by the time he died, half the county thought he'd brought the trouble on himself through bad management and worse character. His voice had not risen. It was still level, but something underneath it had shifted like a current running below still water. I have spent 17 years being careful not to give that man any more ammunition, being quiet, staying on this land and not causing trouble. And it hasn't mattered. He still maneuvered me into that courthouse. He still used your family. He's still running the same scheme. He looked at her directly. I'm done being careful. Abigail held his gaze. Then let's stop being careful together, she said. She sent a letter to the federal land office the next morning through a route Rhett suggested carried by one of his hands, a young man named Cole, who was riding to visit his mother in Pueblo anyway, and could post it from there without connecting it to Callahan Ranch. In the letter, Abigail laid out the basic framework, identical contract language, multiple properties, a pattern of targeted lending followed by engineered default. She signed it with her full married name, Abigail Callahan, for the first time. The name felt different written than it did in her head. She wasn't sure what to do with that. While they waited for a response that might take 2 weeks, or might take 6, they kept working. Rhett sent word quietly to 3 ranching families he trusted: the Hendersons, the Mora family, the widow Dunn, who ran her late husband's cattle operation 15 miles east. The message was simple: I need to know if Whitmore's bank holds your paper and what your rate terms say. No obligation, just looking at something. The Henderson response came back in 4 days, delivered in person by Tom Henderson, who rode in on a Tuesday afternoon, looking like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been offered the chance to set it down. Abigail heard them talking in the yard before she'd reached the window. Tom Henderson's voice carried the specific raw quality of a man who had rehearsed restraint and was now running out of it. 7%, he told my father it was, Tom said. Fixed. That's what the man said to his face. Fixed rate. Tom, you have my word. He said that. And then the letter came saying it was adjustable. All along had been adjustable from the start. And if we couldn't service the new rate, we could discuss alternatives. What alternatives? Rhett said. He wanted the east pasture, the good water access pasture. He said he'd reduce the rate if we signed over the grazing rights for 10 years. Tom stopped. My father signed. I was 18. I didn't know until after. Silence. Tom, Rhett said, I need you to write down everything you just told me. Dates, what your father was told, what the letter said when the terms changed, all of it. What for? Because I think he's done this to more people than either of us knows. And I think there might be a way to stop him, but I need the documentation. Tom Henderson was quiet for a long moment. If this goes wrong, he said finally, he'll take what's left of our place. If we do nothing, Rhett said, he'll take it anyway, just slower. Abigail moved away from the window. She didn't need to hear the rest. She already knew which way Tom Henderson was going to go, because she recognized the particular quality of silence that follows when a man has run out of options and realizes that forward is the only direction left. The town did not know what was happening inside the Callahan ranch, but the town had opinions anyway. This was, Abigail had established simply the nature of the town. She went in for supplies on a Thursday and came back with information she hadn't gone looking for. At the post office waiting for the clerk to sort the morning mail, she overheard 2 men talking in the low carrying voices of people who don't fully understand how sound travels. Whitmore's putting together a second note on the Callahan property, the first man said. Heard it from the clerk at the bank. Callahan's land is free and clear, the second man said. Has been for years. Was free and clear. There's apparently some question about a boundary survey from the original patent. Whitmore says the eastern quarter section was never properly recorded. Abigail kept her eyes on the mail slots and her face neutral. That eastern quarter section's been Callahan land since before I came to this county, the second man said. What Whitmore says and what's true aren't always the same thing. You know that. A pause. That poor girl he married. Whitaker's daughter. She's the one I feel for. Doesn't know what she's walked into. Abigail took her mail from the clerk, said thank you, and walked out. She climbed into the wagon and sat for a moment. A boundary survey, a question about the eastern quarter section. She drove back to the ranch faster than she'd meant to and went straight to Rhett's study, where he was reviewing the season's feed costs. She relayed what she'd heard word for word. Rhett's expression went very still. The original land patent, he said. My father filed it in '51. I've had the document for years. He stood up from the desk. The eastern quarter section was recorded. I watched my father record it. He had a copy made the same day. Do you still have it? He was already moving to the shelves. He went through 3 stacked folders before he stopped. Then he went through them again. He turned around. His face had changed in a way she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not fear. Something colder and more focused than either. The original is gone, he said. The room went very quiet. When's the last time you saw it? She asked. Last spring. I had it out because... He stopped. His jaw tightened. Because Whitmore's man came out here asking about the fence line on the eastern edge. I pulled the patent to show him exactly where the survey markers were. He looked at it, said there was no problem, and left. Did he handle the document? Rhett looked at her. He handled the document, she said. I didn't think... He stopped again. I was standing right there. A man who's been running this scheme for 20 years knows exactly how to take something without you noticing, she said. He didn't need long, just long enough to put it in his coat. Rhett crossed the room and sat down in the chair by the window. Not the desk chair, the plain, straight-backed chair by the window, the one that looked like it was there for the view, but had probably become the place he sat when things needed to be thought about rather than worked. She gave him 30 seconds. Is there a duplicate copy anywhere? She asked. The county recorder's office would have the original filing. Can we get a certified copy from them? County recorder answers to the county judge, he said flatly. Then the state land office in Denver. Which takes weeks. Then we start the weeks now, she said, because they're going to pass either way. He looked up at her. He's going to move before we can build the case. That's what this is, the boundary question, the patent. He's going to file something, get a hearing date, and use a county court before we have time to escalate to federal jurisdiction. How long do we have? If he filed this week, a hearing could be set in 30 days. 30 days. Abigail stood in the middle of the study and thought. She thought about the letter she'd sent through Cole in Pueblo. She thought about Tom Henderson writing his account at a kitchen table somewhere. She thought about the widow Dunn and the Mora family, and how many others there might be with the same clause buried in the same contracts. Then we work faster, she said. The response from the federal land office came not in 2 weeks, but in 11 days, which told her someone in Denver had found the letter interesting enough to prioritize. It came addressed to her. Mrs. Abigail Callahan, the federal seal in the corner. She opened it at the kitchen table, with Rhett standing across from her, and she read it twice before she summarized it aloud. They want documentation, she said. Original contracts, correspondence, evidence of the rate adjustments and the timeline. And they want it within 6 weeks because there's a federal examiner coming through the territory in October. 6 weeks, Rhett said. 6 weeks. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Cole rides fast, but not that fast. We'd need to... I'll go to Denver myself, she said. He looked at her. I can travel faster alone than with a full entourage, she said. I can take the stage from Pueblo. I'll carry the documents myself. I'll be back in 8 days. You're not going alone, he said. I'm not asking permission, she said, not sharply, evenly. I'm informing you of my plan. A pause. Something crossed his face, and she watched him make a deliberate choice not to say what first came to his mind. I'll go with you, he said instead. We go together, or we don't go. That's not about permission. It's about the fact that if Whitmore finds out what we're doing, which he will, you should not be the only one standing between him and those documents. She considered this. It was not unreasonable. In fact, it was, she admitted to herself, correct. Fine, she said. We leave Thursday. Tuesday, he said. We don't have days to spare. Tuesday, she agreed. She started making a list of what to bring. He watched her for a moment, then got up and began pulling folders from the shelves without being asked, organizing the documents they would need to carry. They worked side by side for 2 hours without discussion, and somewhere in that 2 hours, she couldn't have said exactly when the distance across the kitchen table stopped feeling like a width to be maintained and started feeling like a space 2 people were sharing. She noticed it. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. Jahanad. The Tuesday departure did not go as planned. It went worse and then unexpectedly better. The worst part came at dawn when Hector knocked on the kitchen door with his hat in his hands and told them that Whitmore's attorney had served papers on the ranch the previous evening, left with one of the hands when no one of significance was available. A formal notice of contested land claim. The hearing date was set for 22 days out, not 30. 22 days. Rhett read the papers standing in the kitchen doorway. Abigail read them over his shoulder. He knows, she said quietly. He suspected, Rhett said. Tom Henderson's wife went into town last week. Maybe she said something without meaning to. Maybe Whitmore's people are just watching the road. He folded the papers. Either way. Either way, 22 days changes the math. She'll examine her in October. We need someone to come here. Rhett looked at her. The federal examiner, she said. There has to be a way to contact him directly. A man traveling the territory isn't fixed to a desk he can redirect. If we can get word to him that there's an active contested hearing in Durango within 22 days, and that the fraud involves federal land patents, he has jurisdiction to intervene before the county court convenes. That's... Rhett stopped. Is it wrong? No, he said slowly. It's not wrong. I don't know if it's possible. Do you know anyone in Denver who knows how to reach him? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, I know a man, an attorney. He helped me with the original debt clearance 17 years ago. He's retired now, but he has connections. I haven't spoken to him in a long time. Would he help? Another pause. He told me when we finished that if Whitmore ever moved on me again, I should come back to him. He said those words exactly. Then go, she said. Go to Denver. Ride, don't take the stage. You'll cut 2 days. Take Cole and one other man. Ride to Denver. Find your attorney. Get word to the federal examiner and come back. That leaves you here, he said. Alone. I won't be alone. I'll have 14 hands and Hector. She looked at him steadily. And I'll have the copies of every document in that box, which I'm going to spend the next 4 days getting organized and duplicated. Nobody's taking what we've built. He held her gaze for a long moment. She had the sense of a man weighing things that didn't have simple weight. You're going to be all right, he said at last. Not a question. I'm going to be more than all right, she said. Go. He went. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the 3 riders clear the gate, and then she turned around and went back to the table and the boxes and the work. Hector came and stood in the kitchen a few minutes later, coffee in hand, watching her sort documents with the focused efficiency of a woman who had decided that fear was a luxury she could not afford. You're something else, Mrs. Callahan, he said, not admiringly exactly. More the way a man speaks when he's revised an estimate significantly upward. Abigail, she said without looking up. Abigail. He agreed. What do you need from me? She looked up then. I need you to think carefully about every family in this county that Whitmore's bank has ever done business with. Anyone who took a loan, anyone who had trouble with their terms, anyone who sold land or grazing rights under circumstances that didn't sit right afterward. Hector set his coffee down. That's going to be a long list. Good, she said. We have 4 days. And the work that would undo Edgar Whitmore, the slow, careful, precise work of people who had been underestimated for a very long time, began in earnest on a Tuesday morning in a kitchen in Durango, with a woman who had signed her name into a marriage she hadn't chosen, and was now choosing with every hour that passed exactly what that name was going to mean. Rhett had been gone for 36 hours when the first man showed up at the gate. Abigail was in the study cross-referencing the loan dates on Hector's list against the foreclosure records she'd found in the 3rd box when she heard the hand named Duvall call out from the yard. She went to the window, not to look at the view, but to listen, and heard a voice she didn't recognize asking to speak with Mr. Callahan. She went downstairs. The man at the gate was young, maybe 25, with the particular kind of nervous energy that came not from aggression, but from someone who had made a decision that frightened him and was committed to it anyway. He had a letter in his hand folded and refolded enough times that the creases had gone soft. Mr. Callahan isn't here, Abigail said. I'm Mrs. Callahan. What can I do for you? He looked at her the way young men sometimes looked at women who answered doors. They expected men to answer a brief recalibration, a decision about whether this was worth continuing. Then he decided it was. My name is Daniel Reyes, he said. My family runs the Reyes spread about 12 miles south. My father died last spring. The bank Whitmore's bank sent notice last month that our rate has adjusted again. We're at 11% now. He swallowed. We were told it was 6 when my father signed. Abigail stepped back from the doorway. Come in, she said. Tell me everything. He was the 3rd that week. He would not be the last. By the time Rhett rode back in on Thursday evening, covered in trail dust, and running on what looked like 2 hours of sleep, Abigail had taken sworn statements from 5 families. She had organized them chronologically, cross-referenced them against the original Callahan and Whitaker contracts, and written a 12-page summary document in the clearest legal language she could manage, the kind she'd taught herself from her father's books and her own necessity. Rhett walked in the front door and stopped. The kitchen table, the dining table, and half the sitting room floor were covered in organized stacks of paper. Hector sat at one end with a ledger checking figures. Cole's younger brother, who turned out to have neat handwriting, was making copies at the other end. Rhett looked at all of it. Then he looked at her. "You've been busy," he said. "How's your attorney?" she said, alive, willing, and very interested in the name Edgar Whitmore. He pulled a folded letter from his coat and set it on the nearest clear surface. He reached the Federal Examiner. "His name is Aldous Crane. He's been through 3 counties already, and he's heard Whitmore's name twice. Apparently our letter wasn't the only complaint that's made it to Denver." Abigail put down her pen. "Who else filed?" "A woman named Margaret Dunn, which you probably expected, and a man named Vicente Mora, who filed 2 years ago and was told his case had insufficient basis. Crane reopened it last month." Rhett sat down heavily in the nearest chair. He looked exhausted in the bone-deep way of a man who'd been riding on adrenaline and was now at its edge. "Crane will be in Durango in 16 days. He's agreed to review the contested hearing as part of his territorial examination. If the documentation supports federal jurisdiction, he can remove the case from county court." 16 days, Abigail said. 16 days, he confirmed. She looked at the room around her, the papers, the statements, the 12 pages of summary that had taken her 2 nights to write. "Then we have enough time." "If nothing goes wrong," he said. Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. Not the words, the weight under them. "What aren't you telling me?" she said. He met her eyes. "Whitmore's attorney filed an emergency amendment to the hearing notice while I was in Denver. He added a second claim." She waited. "He's arguing the marriage itself is part of a fraudulent arrangement, that I coerced your father into the agreement by threatening to call the Whitaker debt immediately." He said it evenly, the way he said things that cut deep. "He's going to try to have the marriage invalidated, which would eliminate your standing as a party to any contract dispute related to Callahan Holdings." The room went quiet enough that she could hear Cole's brother's pen scratching across paper. Abigail stood very still and worked through the implications. If the marriage was invalidated, she became Abigail Whitaker. Again, a single woman with no legal standing in the Callahan property dispute, whose testimony carried the weight of a motivated outsider rather than a wife. The 5 sworn statements she'd gathered, the summary document, the cross-referenced evidence, all of it would require her credibility as a party with direct interest. Strip that, and Whitmore had neutralized half their case in one move. "He found out what we're doing," she said. "Yes. And he's not trying to stop the evidence. He's trying to stop me." "Yes," Rhett said again. She thought about Edgar Whitmore in that courthouse, his pressed suit, his pleasant smile, the way he'd laughed when Rhett said he didn't keep people who didn't want to be kept. She thought about how he'd used her family as a lever, how he'd assumed she was a tool that could be deployed and then discarded. "He made a mistake," she said. Rhett looked at her. "Which one?" "He assumed this marriage was something I would want to escape." She picked up her pen. "If he'd left it alone, maybe I would have. But he's made it the ground we fight on. And that means I'm going to defend it." A silence opened in the room. Not an empty silence, a full one. "Abigail," Rhett said. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not the bracing look. Not the careful measuring look. Not even the exposed look from that night at the kitchen table. This was something past all of those. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like a man who was frightened of what he felt and was deciding whether to hide it or not. "You don't have to defend it on my account," he said. "If you want out legally cleanly, I'll help you get there. I told you that in the courthouse." I know you did, she said. I meant it. I know that too. She held his gaze. I'm not doing this on your account. I'm doing it because Edgar Whitmore decided who I was before I walked in the room, and I intend to show him exactly how wrong he was. A pause. The fact that it also happens to protect your land and our case is what you might call a fortunate alignment of interests. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face settled, not closed. Settled. The way a man looks when he's been holding tension in his shoulders for so long. He's forgotten it was there, and then it releases. Fortunate alignment, he said. Don't make it more than it is, she said, but her voice had lost its edge about halfway through the sentence. He almost smiled. I wouldn't dream of it. Out. They had 14 days left when Mrs. Harlan Briggs paid a call. This was not something Abigail had anticipated, and in retrospect, she should have. Mrs. Briggs arrived in a hired buggy on a Friday afternoon, carrying a basket of preserves as social cover, and wearing the expression of a woman on a mission. She was going to dress up as kindness for as long as the kindness held. Abigail received her in the sitting room. The papers had been cleared to the study. Everything looked from the outside like a normal ranch household. I hope I'm not intruding, Mrs. Briggs said, setting the basket down with a decisive click that suggested she'd intrude regardless. Not at all, Abigail said. Tea, please. Mrs. Briggs settled into the chair across from the settee and arranged herself with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent 40 years making herself comfortable in other people's houses. I wanted to check on you after what I heard at the bank. Abigail poured the tea. And what did you hear at the bank? That Whitmore's filed some kind of legal action. A pause waited with performed concern. Something about the property boundary, and something about the marriage. She looked at Abigail directly. My dear, if the situation here is difficult, you know that there are people in town who would help you. Quietly, discreetly. Help me do what? Abigail said pleasantly. Leave if it came to that. Abigail set her own cup down. She looked at Mrs. Briggs with the calm, clear look of a woman who has had this conversation already in her own head and knows exactly how it ends. Mrs. Briggs, she said, may I ask you something directly? Of course. Has Edgar Whitmore ever spoken to you about my marriage or about my husband? A flicker, very brief, but there. Edgar and I are on the church council together naturally, so Has he asked you to come here? The flicker again. Certainly not. I came of my own concern. Because if he did, Abigail said, still pleasant, still even, I'd want you to tell him something for me. You can tell him that Abigail Callahan is exactly where she wants to be, and that she is not available to be relocated for his convenience. Mrs. Briggs's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. I'm not sure I think you are sure, Abigail said. And I think you're a woman who's had her own dealings with Whitmore's bank over the years, and I think you understand more about the situation in this county than you let on. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you know that the story you've been telling yourself about my husband is the story Edgar Whitmore told you. She paused. Is that unfair? A very long silence. Mrs. Briggs set her cup down. The performed concern had evaporated. What was underneath it was harder to read, something between chagrin and a more complicated emotion. He's a convincing man, she said quietly. He is, Abigail agreed. That's his entire business model. She didn't tell Rhett about the visit immediately. Not because she was hiding it, but because by the time he came in from the north pasture, they'd had a fence section fail, and he'd been out most of the day. She had something more urgent to address. Daniel Reyes had come back. Not alone this time. He'd brought his older brother and a man named Ike Paulson, who ranched the strip of land between the Reyes spread and the Mora property, and Ike Paulson had in his possession a letter from Whitmore's bank dated 3 weeks ago, hand-delivered, offering to purchase his land at roughly 40 cents on the dollar. He said if I didn't take the offer, he'd be forced to call the note, Ike said. He was a big man, quiet in the way of men who've spent most of their lives working rather than talking. "I've got 2 more payments, and the note's cleared. 2 payments. He can't call it early." "Let me see the original contract," Abigail said. He had it with him. She read it in 4 minutes. The clause was there. The same clause word for word that appeared in the Whitaker contract and the original Callahan contract, and she was willing to bet every other document in that pile. The lender reserves the right to demand full settlement of outstanding balance upon evidence of material change in market conditions or property valuation. "He's going to call your note," she said. "He'll manufacture a property valuation drop. It wouldn't take much a questionable appraisal, a letter from a surveyor he controls. Then he'll claim market conditions and call everything due at once." Ike Paulson looked at her. Then he looked at Rhett, who had come in quietly and was standing in the doorway. "Callahan," he said, "you vouching for her?" "I'm vouching for the fact that she's 3 times smarter than either of us," Rhett said, "and that she's the one who figured out the clause pattern in the first place." Ike Paulson looked at Abigail for a long moment. Then he said, "What do I do?" "Don't respond to the purchase offer," she said. "Not yet. Send nothing in writing. And bring me every piece of correspondence you've received from Whitmore's bank in the last 5 years. You think that'll help?" "I think the more people whose documents show the same template, the cleaner the federal case becomes," she said. "1 family is an anomaly. 3 is a pattern. 7 is a conspiracy." "How many do you have?" he asked. She glanced at Rhett. "We're at 6 sworn statements, with yours 7. Ike Paulson looked at his hands. He was the kind of man who thought with his hands not fidgeting, just resting them where he could see them like they anchored him. "All right," he said. 7 it is. 10 days before the hearing, the barn calf almost died. This was not a legal crisis or a strategic problem. It was simply what ranches did. Life and death arrived without scheduling, without regard for what else was happening. The calf had been weak at birth 3 weeks prior and had been touch and go since. That night, it went from touch and go to genuinely critical, and Abigail knew because she heard Rhett leave the house at 2 in the morning. She didn't decide to follow him. She was simply awake, and then she was dressed, and then she was walking across the dark yard to the barn. He was kneeling beside the calf in the straw, his sleeves rolled up. His voice low and continuous, not quite talking, not quite anything that had words to it. The kind of sound a person makes when they're trying to transmit steadiness directly, when language isn't the point. Abigail stopped in the doorway. The calf's breathing was shallow, but not desperate. Rhett's hands moved carefully, checking, adjusting the specific, practiced competence of someone who had done this many times. But it was the voice that stopped her. That low, continuous, wordless sound of reassurance from a man the town called a monster. She crossed the distance between them and knelt beside him in the straw without asking. He looked at her. She looked at the calf. "What do I do?" she said. He guided her hands to where his had been the pressure point, the angle, the rhythm. He showed her without explaining beyond what was necessary, because the calf didn't need explanation, it needed steadiness, and Abigail understood that immediately and gave it. They worked side by side in the barn for 2 hours. The calf's breathing evened. Its eyes, which had been dull and half-closed, found focus. At some point, Rhett said very quietly, almost to himself, "Don't be afraid of me." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the calf. "I used to say that to the animals when I first started," he said, "when they came in hurt or scared. My father thought it was foolish talking to cattle." A pause. "But it worked." "It doesn't sound foolish," she said. He looked at her then. In the low light of the barn, with the calf breathing steadily between them, the distance that had existed between them since the courthouse, courteous, maintained, mutual, had simply at some point in the last 2 hours been replaced by something else. Not closeness exactly. Something more honest than closeness. The specific quality of 2 people who have been stripped of their performances and are left with whatever was underneath. "Abigail," he said. "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't say whatever careful thing you were about to say," she said. "Not tonight." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said, back across the yard in the dark, and went inside, and neither of them said anything about what had shifted in the barn that night. But it had shifted, and they both knew it had shifted, and knowing was enough for now. 7 days before the hearing, Whitmore made his first open move. He came to the ranch himself, not his attorney, not his man. Whitmore in person in his pressed suit, driving his own hired buggy up the road to the Callahan gate on a Wednesday morning like a man paying a social call. Abigail was in the kitchen when Hector knocked and told her. She took off her apron, folded it precisely, set it on the counter, and went to the door. Rhett was already in the yard. Whitmore stood just inside the gate, his hat in his hand, his smile doing what it always did, existing on the surface without reference to anything beneath. He looked at Rhett first, then at Abigail beside him, and something in his smile recalibrated almost imperceptibly. "Callahan," he said pleasantly. "I thought we might talk, like reasonable men." "My wife's standing right here," Rhett said. "So we'll talk like reasonable people." A slight pause. "Of course." He looked at Abigail directly. "Mrs. Callahan, I want you to know that the legal proceedings aren't personal. Business is business. The boundary claim is a matter of record." "There is no record," Abigail said. "The original patent was filed correctly in 1851, and you know it because you had your man take the copy last spring. The certified duplicate arrived from the state land office in Denver 4 days ago." She watched something move behind his eyes. "Did you think we wouldn't request one?" The smile held, but it had to work harder now. "I see you've been busy." "We have," she said. "We've also been in contact with federal land examiner Aldous Crane, who will be sitting in on the hearing. And we have sworn statements from 7 ranch families in this county detailing the same contractual clause, the same rate adjustment pattern, and the same sequence of manufactured defaults." She paused. "But I suspect you already know about Mr. Crane, because you moved up the hearing date when you heard he was coming." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. The pleasantness was still there, but it had gone thin, a coat of paint over something older and harder. "You're a clever woman," he said. "Your father didn't mention that." "My father didn't know," she said. "He thought I was just keeping his books." A beat. "This can still be resolved quietly," Whitmore said. His voice had changed, not threatening, but stripped of the social performance. This was the voice under the voice. "The boundary claim gets withdrawn. The contested hearing becomes routine. Everyone goes back to their business. All I need is for this investigation to stop." "No," Abigail said. "Just that. Clean and flat and final." Whitmore looked at Rhett. "Callahan, talk sense to your wife." Rhett looked at Whitmore with an expression Abigail had not seen on his face before. 17 years of being careful, of being quiet, of absorbing the story Whitmore had told the county and not fighting it because fighting cost too much. "She's talking plenty of sense," Rhett said. "More than I've managed in 17 years." Whitmore put his hat back on. The social call had ended. "You understand what this means," he said. Not a question. "It means the truth comes out," Abigail said, "which is what it should have meant 20 years ago." He left without another word. Abigail stood in the yard and watched the buggy clear the gate. Beside her, Rhett was very still. "He's going to go after the statements," he said. "He'll try to pressure the families into withdrawing." "I know," she said. "That's why I made copies of everything and sent one set to your attorney in Denver yesterday." He turned and looked at her. "And a second set to Examiner Crane directly," she said. "So there's nothing left to pressure." He looked at her for a long moment. The look that had lived in his face from the first day, the bracing waiting look, was gone. Something had taken its place, something that didn't have armor on it. "Who are you?" he said, not dismissively, like a man asking a genuine question, one he should have asked sooner. "Abigail Callahan," she said. "Your wife, and I'm not afraid of him." She turned back toward the house. She had 6 more days of work to do, and she intended to do all of it. The 6 days between Whitmore's visit and the hearing were the longest of Abigail's life, and also in a way she couldn't have anticipated the most clarifying. Whitmore moved fast. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was the specific shape his pressure took, not legal filings, not formal challenges, but the older, cruder tool of social force. By Thursday, 2 of the 7 families had sent word that they were withdrawing their statements. Not in writing, nothing that could be used against them, just messages carried by hand, apologetic and brief. The Reyes brothers. Pressure on their remaining credit line at the bank, Daniel's message said. They couldn't risk it. Abigail read the message twice. Then she folded it and set it aside. 5 statements, she told Rhett that evening. Still 5. He'll go after the others, Rhett said. He already has. The Hendersons got a visit from his attorney yesterday. Tom Henderson told him to leave his property. She paused. Tom Henderson is angrier than I've ever seen a man be politely. Tom grew up watching his father get maneuvered, Rhett said. He's been waiting for a reason to fight back. Then we make sure he has one. She pulled the summary document toward her, the 12 pages she'd written, and revised again, now 16 pages with the additions from the past week. Rhett. The Reyes withdrawal, does that hurt us significantly? He thought about it honestly, which she'd come to understand was the only way he thought about anything. It weakens the pattern argument slightly, 5 families instead of 7. But the documents themselves, the clause, the rate letters, the timeline, those don't need witness statements to speak. The paper says what it says. Then the paper is enough, she said. As long as Crane reads it. He'll read it, Rhett said. My attorney knows him, says he's the kind of man who actually does the job he was sent to do. There aren't as many of those as there should be, she said. No, he agreed. There aren't. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, the night had gone cold and clear, the kind of cold that in Colorado came before a weather change. She could feel it in the way the house settled. My father sent a letter, she said. Rhett looked up. Apologizing, she said. Which is something he's never done in my memory. He said he wanted me to know he understood now that I hadn't been given a choice, and that he... She stopped. The words had been harder to read than she'd expected them to be. He said he hoped I was being treated well. Are you? Rhett said. Quietly. She looked at him across the table. The candle between them had burned to half. The papers were everywhere, as they always were now, as they would be until this was finished. Better than I expected, she said. Better than I had any right to. Something moved in his face. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away. Write back to him, Rhett said at last. Tell him he can come visit when this is done, if you want him to. She looked at him. This is your house. It's your house too, he said. I thought we'd established that. She looked back down at the papers. But something in her chest had shifted the way things shifted in that barn, quietly, without announcement, into a new position. The night before the hearing, Abigail couldn't sleep. This was not unusual for the past 2 weeks, but tonight it was different. Tonight, the work was done. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. The documents were organized in a leather satchel that Rhett's attorney, who had ridden in from Denver 2 days ago, a compact, sharp-eyed man named Arthur Finch, had reviewed and approved. The 5 remaining statements were certified. The duplicate land patent from the state office was signed and sealed. Examiner Crane had confirmed his attendance in a letter delivered by his own courier, which Whitmore would know about, and which meant Whitmore knew he'd lost the element of surprise. What Whitmore had left was the county courtroom, the county judge, and 20 years of manufactured reputation. It wasn't nothing. Abigail got up, put on her shawl, and went downstairs. Rhett was not in the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, the kitchen was empty and dark. She made coffee herself and sat at the table alone and thought about the courthouse in Durango, which was where she'd started, which was where tomorrow would be decided. She thought about her mother's dress and her father's signature and the ink spreading across paper like a wound, which was how she'd described it to herself that day, and which she realized now was not entirely accurate. A wound was something that happened to you. What she'd done in that courthouse was something she'd chosen with no good options under compulsion, but chosen nonetheless. What she was doing tomorrow was also a choice. A clearer one made with more information from a stronger position for reasons that had grown beyond simple self-preservation into something she cared about in its own right. She heard the stairs creak. Rhett appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed awake, looking like he'd also given up on sleep as a reasonable project. "I made coffee," she said. "I can see that." He came in and poured a cup and sat across from her. Same table, same positions, but not the same distance. The distance had been closing incrementally for weeks, and tonight it was close enough that she could feel the warmth of another person's presence without reaching for it. "Are you afraid?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave all real questions. "Not of the hearing," he said. "Not anymore." "What then?" He looked at his cup. "Of what it looks like if we win." She waited. "I've spent 17 years being the man this county decided I was," he said. "The feared one, the dangerous one. It's a limited life, but it's a known one." He turned the cup in his hands. "If the truth comes out tomorrow, if Whitmore is exposed, and the land is clear, and the families get their remedies, then what the county recalibrates. People who've crossed the street to avoid me start tipping their hats. Whitmore's friends become my neighbors who are embarrassed about being his friends." He paused. "I don't know what to do with that." "You do the same thing you've been doing," she said. "Run the ranch. Take care of your people. Be exactly who you are." She paused. "You've always known who you were. You just couldn't make them see it." He looked at her. "You saw it." "I looked," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, what you've done here, for these families, what you figured out and built and documented, that mattered, regardless of the outcome. The outcome is going to be fine," she said. "You can't know that." "No," she admitted. "But I'm choosing to believe it anyway, because the alternative is being afraid tonight, and I need to sleep." He almost laughed. It was the closest she'd heard him come to it, a low, involuntary sound that didn't make it all the way to his face, but came close. "Go sleep," he said. "I'll sit up. You should sleep too." "I know," he said. "I will, in a while." She got up, paused at the kitchen doorway. "Rhett." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "For the key in the lock. The first night." He held her gaze. "You were always going to be all right," he said. "I just wanted you to know it." She went upstairs. She slept. The courthouse in Durango was full in a way it hadn't been on the day of the wedding. Abigail noticed it the moment they arrived. People standing along the walls. Ranching families she recognized, the Hendersons, the Mora family, the widow Dunn, who had driven in from 15 miles east and looked like she'd fight anyone who told her to sit down. Townspeople, too, including in the back row, Mrs. Harlan Briggs, who met Abigail's eyes briefly and gave a nod that carried, if Abigail was reading it right, something approximating resolve. Word had traveled. It always did in small counties. But what had traveled this time was not the old story, not the story about Rhett Callahan and his dangerous reputation. What had traveled was the other story. The one that had been moving quietly from kitchen table to kitchen table and ranch to ranch for the past 2 weeks. Whitmore was already seated at the plaintiff's table when they came in with 2 attorneys instead of 1 and a posture of arranged confidence. He looked at Abigail when she entered and held her gaze for exactly 1 second before looking away. She looked at him for 2. Arthur Finch guided them to the respondent's table with the efficiency of a man who had been in more courtrooms than he cared to count and had strong opinions about positioning. Examiner Crane sat to the side of the judge's bench, not at it, a compact man in his 50s with steady eyes and a leather folder on his lap, that Abigail knew contained her 12-page summary because Finch had sent it to him directly. Judge Harold Paris entered and called the room to order. He was a heavyset man who wore his bench authority like a piece of clothing he'd been given and wasn't fully comfortable in. He looked at Whitmore's table first, and something in that first look told Abigail everything she needed to know about whose side Judge Paris had historically been on. The first hour belonged to Whitmore. His lead attorney laid out the boundary claim with the smoothness of prepared performance maps, a surveyor's affidavit, a chain of documentation that looked on the surface complete and reasonable. The argument was clean. The Eastern Quarter section had never been properly recorded in the county ledger. Therefore, Callahan's claim to it was clouded. Therefore, the bank's interest in the adjacent property was legitimate. Judge Paris listened with what appeared to be attentiveness. Examiner Crane took notes. Then Arthur Finch rose and placed the certified copy of the original 1851 land patent on the table in front of the judge. The quarter section in question was recorded on April 14, 1851 at the State Land Office in Denver. Finch said, "This is the certified duplicate bearing the seal of the State of Colorado Territory. The county ledger entry, which the plaintiff claims is absent, was not absent. It was removed." The room shifted. Whitmore's attorney was on his feet. "That's a serious allegation." "It is," Finch agreed. "Which is why we have an affidavit from the State Land Office clerk confirming the original filing date and a letter from the county recorder's office acknowledging a gap in the ledger records from the period in question that has not been explained." He set both documents on the table. Mr. Whitmore's agent visited this ranch last spring to examine the property line. He had access to the original document. The document disappeared from the ranch's records shortly after that visit. The room was very quiet. Judge Paris looked at Whitmore. Not at his attorneys. At Whitmore directly. And something in the judge's face, some calculus, was visibly running. "We'll move to the second matter," Finch said. He turned to Examiner Crane. "With the examiner's permission." Crane nodded. "Proceed." Finch presented the contracts. All 5 remaining sworn statements. The clause identical across every document in a side-by-side comparison that Abigail had spent a full night preparing, and which was now on a single large sheet that could be read from a distance. The rate adjustment letters. The timeline of engineered defaults. It took 45 minutes to lay it out. The room held its silence with the specific compressed quality of people who are hearing something confirmed that they had suspected for a long time without being able to say it aloud. Whitmore's attorneys objected 17 times. Paris sustained 4 of them. Crane overruled 2 of those 4 on federal jurisdictional grounds quietly and without drama. And each time he did, Whitmore's lead attorney looked at Whitmore, and Whitmore's arranged confidence shifted a fraction of a degree. Then Abigail was called to speak. Finch had prepared her for this, what to say, how to frame it, where the legal weight lay, and where the personal testimony supported it. She had memorized the structure and then set the memorization aside because memorized things sounded memorized, and what this room needed was not a performance. She stood. She spoke clearly and at a pace that the court recorder could follow. She explained how she'd found the clause in her family's contract, how she'd recognized it in the Callahan documents, how the cross-referencing had revealed a pattern spanning more than a decade across multiple properties. She kept her voice level. She kept her hands still. She looked at Examiner Crane more than she looked at Judge Paris because Crane was the one whose jurisdiction could override the room. She was 2/3 through her testimony when Whitmore's attorney stood and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to challenge the witness's standing. The marriage between this woman and the respondent is itself under challenge." "On what grounds?" Crane said, not loudly, just clearly. "Coercion. The respondent held debt over the Whitaker family." "Mr. Callahan held no debt over the Whitaker family," Abigail said. She had not been given permission to speak out of turn. She spoke anyway. "Edgar Whitmore's bank held the Whitaker debt. Rhett Callahan paid it, in full, on the day of the marriage. The payment record is in Exhibit 7. The attorney stopped. The suggestion that my husband coerced this marriage is the same inversion Mr. Whitmore has applied to every situation in this county for 20 years, she said. He creates the pressure, he manufactures the crisis, and then he points at the people surviving it and calls them the problem. Her voice had not risen. It didn't need to. I married Rhett Callahan because my family had no options, and he offered one. I am here today because when I looked at the evidence, I found that the man who destroyed those options was not my husband. It was the man sitting at that table. The room did not make a sound. Whitmore was looking at her. She looked back at him. Judge Paris said carefully, "The standing challenge is noted for the record. We'll proceed with the testimony." Whitmore's attorney sat down. He didn't look at his client. The break came at midday, and it was during the break that the second twist arrived. Abigail was standing outside the courthouse with Rhett and Finch reviewing the afternoon session when Tom Henderson pushed through the small crowd at the door and came directly to them. His face was set with the specific expression of a man carrying information he'd debated sharing and had decided he couldn't afford not to. "There's a man inside," Tom said quietly. "Name of Garrett. He worked for Whitmore's bank for 11 years as a land assessor. He quit 8 months ago. I know him, used to ride the same circuit as my uncle." He paused. "He's got documents, assessments he falsified on Whitmore's instructions, the valuations he manipulated to trigger the market conditions clause." Finch went very still. "He's willing to testify. He came to the courthouse on his own," Tom said. "He's been sitting in the back since it opened. He didn't know if he was going to say anything." Then he heard her. He nodded at Abigail. "He says if she can stand up in there and say it plain, so can he." Finch looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at Rhett. "A former bank assessor with falsified documents," Rhett said quietly, "is the piece we didn't have." "It's not just the piece we didn't have," Finch said. "It's the case. Internal documents. Admitted falsification. That's not a civil land dispute anymore. That's criminal fraud." The afternoon session reconvened. Arthur Finch requested and Examiner Crane granted the addition of a witness not previously listed. Whitmore's attorneys objected with considerable heat. Crane looked at them with the patience of a man who had already made up his mind about what was happening in this room and was simply managing the process. "The witness will be heard," Crane said. James Garrett was perhaps 50, with the gaunt look of a man who hadn't been sleeping well, and the steadiness of one who had decided that sleep wasn't coming back until he did the right thing. He sat in the witness position and spoke in the careful, measured tone of someone reciting facts he'd been carrying alone for too long. He had falsified 14 property assessments over 7 years, all at Whitmore's direction, all tied to properties where the market conditions clause needed a triggering event. He had the original assessments, the accurate ones and the filed versions, and he had kept both because he said simply he'd known this day would come, and he'd wanted to be able to tell the truth when it did. Whitmore's lead attorney didn't cross-examine him. He leaned over to Whitmore and spoke in his ear, and Whitmore's face, for the first time since Abigail had known him, lost its arrangement entirely. What was underneath was not anger. It was the look of a man who has run a calculation and found that the numbers no longer work. Examiner Crane called the recess at 3:15. When he returned, he announced that the Federal Land Office was assuming jurisdiction over the contested boundary claim that the criminal fraud allegations would be referred to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office, and that all pending foreclosure proceedings tied to Whitmore's bank were suspended pending investigation. He looked at Judge Paris when he said it. Not unkindly, just clearly. Paris said nothing. Rhett's hand found Abigail's under the table. Not dramatically, just there. Her fingers closed around his without thinking about it. The room erupted, not chaotically. The people in that courtroom were ranchers and farmers and townspeople who had been holding something compressed for a long time, and what came out of them now was not noise so much as breath. The specific released exhale of people who have been told that what they knew was wrong has finally been called wrong by someone with the authority to say so. Tom Henderson put his hat on and took it off again. The widow Dunn said something short and emphatic under her breath that was lost in the general sound. Daniel Reyes, who had come back, who had slipped in through the side door sometime in the second hour. Abigail realized, sat with his hands over his face for a moment, and then took them down, and his expression was the expression of a young man recalibrating his understanding of what was possible. Whitmore left through the side door with his attorneys. No statement, no final smile. He crossed the room and went through the door, and it closed behind him, and that was for now the end of Edgar Whitmore in Durango. Outside on the courthouse steps in the thin autumn sunlight, the county gathered in the loose and slightly stunned way of people who have just watched something historic and are not entirely sure what to do next. Rhett stood beside Abigail, not behind her, not in front of her. Beside her with the particular quality of presence that meant she could feel him there without needing to look. Hector found them first because Hector always found them. He shook Rhett's hand with both of his and didn't say anything, because Hector Gaines understood the difference between moments that needed words and moments that didn't. Tom Henderson said, "Mrs. Callahan, I want to say," and then seemed to run out of language for a moment. "Thank you," he managed finally. "My father would have—" He stopped again. "Your father kept the documents," she said. "That's what made it possible." Tom Henderson put his hat on properly this time, and nodded and went to find his wife. The widow Dunn shook Abigail's hand with a grip that belonged on someone twice her size and said, "You remind me of myself at your age," which Abigail took as the highest compliment she had ever been paid. Eventually the crowd thinned, as crowds do, pulled by the business of living that doesn't stop for courthouses or revelations. Finch had paperwork to handle, and Crane had a meeting with the prosecutor's office, and the day was moving toward evening without asking anyone's permission. Abigail and Rhett stood on the courthouse steps long after most people had gone. Not because there was anything left to do there, but because neither of them had moved. "It's not over," she said. "The criminal referral, the investigation, that takes months." "I know," he said. "Whitmore will have resources. He'll fight the prosecution." "He will," Rhett agreed. "But the land is clear. The families have grounds for civil remedy, and the county knows." She paused. "The county finally knows." He looked at her. In the late afternoon light with the courthouse behind them and the town spread out below, he looked like a man who had put down something heavy so long ago that he'd forgotten he was carrying it and had only just now noticed the absence of the weight. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "You kept every piece of paper for 17 years. You reached out to Finch. You sent Cole to Pueblo with my letter. You rode to Denver in 2 days." She met his eyes. "Neither of us did it alone." He looked at her for a long moment with that open expression that didn't have armor on it, the one she'd first seen in the barn, and hadn't seen him take back since. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "I don't think there are words for it." "Then don't use words," she said. "Just take me home." And something in his face, in the set of his jaw and the line of his shoulders, and the particular quality of stillness that was the truest thing about Rhett Callahan, simply quietly broke open into something new. "Yes," he said. "Let's go home." The ride home from the courthouse took 2.5 hours, the same as the ride there on the day they married, and the silence between them was nothing like that first silence. That first silence had been the silence of two strangers who didn't know what they owed each other. This one was something a person could rest in. Abigail sat beside him on the bench and watched the road and thought about nothing in particular, which was the first time in 6 weeks she'd been able to think about nothing in particular, and it felt like setting down a weight she hadn't fully accounted for until it was gone. Rhett drove the team without speaking, which was his natural condition, and which she had stopped reading as coldness somewhere around the 3rd week. He spoke when he had something to say. When he didn't, he was quiet. It was one of the things she had come to trust about him, that his words meant something because he didn't spend them carelessly. About an hour out from the ranch, he said, "Your father's letter. You never told me what you wrote back." She looked at him. "I told him he could come in the spring, when the weather's easier. And," she paused, "and I told him I was all right, that I was more than all right." She watched the road. "I told him I'd found something I hadn't expected to find." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him you found?" "A fair man," she said simply. "I told him I found a fair man." He didn't answer, but his hands on the reins shifted slightly, and she understood that as the equivalent of something a more expressive person would have said out loud. "Yes." The ranch came back into itself slowly in the days after the hearing. Not dramatically. Real life rarely reorganized itself. Dramatically, it moved in the smaller adjustments of daily things returning to their natural weight. Hector ran the morning assignments with his usual precision. The hands worked the fence lines and the water troughs and the cattle rotation. The calf that had almost died was gaining strength steady now, which Abigail checked on every morning with a thoroughness that she refused to examine too closely for what it meant about her attachment. But things were different. The first indication came 3 days after the hearing, when 2 of Whitmore's bank's loan officers rode out to the Henderson ranch and left without completing the meeting they'd come to threaten. Tom Henderson sent word that they'd been quiet and small, in a way that men who have lost their institutional backing always were, and he'd sent them home. The second came from Deputy Crane at the sheriff's office, who sent a note to Rhett, the first communication between them in years that wasn't formal or cold, saying simply that he wanted to meet at Rhett's convenience to discuss several outstanding matters that Crane now felt had been handled incorrectly. Which was the closest a man of Crane's generation would come to saying he was sorry. The third came in the form of an envelope from Gerald Whitaker, addressed to both of them, which was something Gerald had not previously managed. Inside was a short letter and a receipt, the deed to the 2 acres and house that had been part of the original arrangement, properly transferred now into Abigail's name, directly, not Callahan's, not Gerald's, her own. She stood in the kitchen and read the transfer deed twice. "Your father did this," Rhett said, reading over her shoulder. "He must have had the lawyer redo the paperwork," she said. "He wanted me to have something that was mine, separate. That's a significant thing for him to do." "Yes," she said. "It is." She folded the deed carefully and put it in the correspondence box in the study, the same box that had held the evidence, which now held the pieces of whatever came next. She didn't say anything else about it. But that night at dinner, she was quieter than usual, and Rhett didn't press her. And that consideration was its own kind of gift. Arthur Finch rode back out to the ranch 10 days after the hearing with the formal update the territorial prosecutor had filed charges against Edgar Whitmore on 4 counts of deliberate fraud and 1 count of document theft. Whitmore had retained representation from a Denver firm and was expected to mount a vigorous defense. The process would take time, possibly a year, possibly longer. "But the land claims are resolved," Rhett asked. "The boundary claim is dismissed with prejudice," Finch said. "The marriage challenge was withdrawn when they filed the criminal defense they needed to stop bleeding on multiple fronts." He paused and looked at Abigail. "Your standing as Mrs. Callahan is uncontested." "And the other families?" she asked. "The civil remedies process is underway. It'll be slow. The bank is still operating under a conservator while the investigation proceeds, so their credit lines are uncertain. But the pattern of fraud is documented and admitted into federal record." He looked at both of them. "You built an airtight case. In 6 weeks with limited resources against a man who had 20 years and half the county behind him. I want to say that plainly because I've been doing this for 30 years, and I don't often say it plainly." Abigail thanked him. Rhett walked him out. When he came back inside, Abigail was at the kitchen table with the ledger open. Not the evidence boxes, but the ranch ledger, the actual books, the running accounts she'd taken over managing 3 weeks ago because she was better at them, and Rhett had acknowledged it without ego and handed them over. "You're working," he said. "The feed cost for the winter quarter needs to be adjusted," she said. "We're going to be short on the East Pasture supplemental if we don't order now." He sat across from her. "Abigail." She looked up. "The case is done," he said. "Can you stop for one evening?" She looked at him, then at the ledger, then back at him. "The feed cost is actually... It can wait until tomorrow." She closed the ledger. He set a cup of coffee in front of her. He'd made it while she wasn't paying attention, which was something he'd started doing without comment, the way people who share a space develop habits around each other. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "What do we do now?" she said. Not anxiously, genuinely. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "We built the last 6 weeks around a specific fight," she said. "It gave everything a shape. Now the shape is different." She paused. "I mean, what do we do? You and I, in this house, going forward." He was quiet for a moment. She appreciated that he didn't rush to answer, because a rushed answer would have been a performance, and this wasn't the kind of conversation that needed one. "I think we do what we've been doing," he said at last, "except without Whitmore as the reason for it." "That's not a very specific answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at her coffee. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "The families, the Hendersons, the Reyeses, the widow Dunn. Their credit situation is going to be complicated for months while the bank is under the conservator. They can't borrow for operating expenses, can't expand, can't weather a bad season." He waited. "What if we set up a lending arrangement through the ranch?" she said. "Not a bank, just neighbor lending. Short-term reasonable rates, no clauses." She paused. "We have the resources, and we have the documentation knowledge now to do it right." He stared at her. "Too much," she said. "No," he said. "It's not too much." He looked at her with that open expression. "I'm trying to understand when you sleep." "I sleep fine," she said. "I think while I'm doing other things." "Clearly." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "The ranch has the liquidity for it. If we keep the amounts modest and the terms honest, there's no legal complication." A pause. "You'd run it." "We'd run it," she said. He looked at her across the table. Across the ledger and the cups, and the months of shared work and the distance that had been closing since the first night she'd found the error in his columns, and he'd said 3 weeks, with the particular humility of a man who doesn't pretend to be everything. "You came in here planning to survive," he said. "Yes," she said. "And now you're building something." "I'm building several things," she said. "The question is whether you're building them with me." He held her gaze for a long moment. She'd gotten better at reading him, better at understanding the specific quality of his silences, which ones were walls, and which ones were a man arriving at something true. This one was the second kind. "Yes," he said, "I am." The stockman's dinner came in the 3rd week of October, which was the county's annual gathering of ranching families held at the Durango Grange Hall, and attended by everyone who worked land in the territory. Abigail had heard about it from Hector, who mentioned it neutrally, which was his way of mentioning things he thought she should know without telling her what to do about them. Rhett had not attended in 9 years. He told her this the evening before, flatly without drama, in the way he disclosed things that had simply been facts of his life. "We should go," she said. He looked at her. "You want to go." "I want the county to see us go," she said. "There's a difference, and I'm being honest about it." She paused. The hearing changed the story, but stories need to be lived in public to fully change. If you stay home, half the town will read it as shame. "And if I go?" "If we go," she said, "they see a man who had nothing to be ashamed of." He thought about it. She gave him the full space of the thinking, which was also something she'd learned not to fill his silences before they'd resolved into decisions. "All right," he said. The Grange Hall was full when they arrived, and she felt the room shift the moment they walked in. Not hostilely. More the way a room shifts when something expected differently has arrived and the assembled people need a moment to reorganize their expectations. Tom Henderson found them within 2 minutes and shook Rhett's hand with a forcefulness that said everything his words didn't. The widow Dunn raised her glass from across the room and nodded. Vicente Mora, who Abigail hadn't met, crossed the room specifically to introduce himself and say in a quiet, formal way that he owed them more than he could say, and he was aware of it. "You don't owe us anything," Abigail said. "You kept your records. That's what made it possible. My father kept them, he said. I thought about burning them 6 years ago when the first challenge came. I thought they were only bringing trouble. He paused. I'm glad I didn't. So are we, Rhett said. Then Whitmore's friends arrived. Not Whitmore, he was in Denver managing his legal situation. But two of the men who'd been consistently in his circle, who'd sat on the county council alongside him and socialized at his table, and absorbed his version of events for 20 years, Harold Briggs, who was Mrs. Briggs's husband, and ran the feed store, and a man named Casto, who owned the largest mercantile. Abigail watched them clock the room, watched them see the Hendersons and the Mora family and the widow Dunn, and understand that the social arithmetic had changed. Harold Briggs came over first. He was a plain man, not unkind, looking just a man who'd taken the easier road for a long time and was now facing a stretch of harder road and wasn't sure of his footing. He looked at Rhett. Callahan, he said, I owe you an apology that I don't know how to make. Rhett looked at him steadily. You believed what you were told, he said. A lot of people did. I should have looked harder, Briggs said. Yes, Rhett said, not cruelly, just honestly. You should have. Briggs looked at Abigail. Mrs. Callahan, my wife thinks very highly of you. Your wife is a perceptive woman, Abigail said, when she chooses to be. Briggs almost smiled. It was a rueful, appropriate kind of almost smile. He nodded and moved away. Casto didn't come over. He stood at the far side of the room all evening and didn't come over. And that was its own kind of answer about where he stood, and Abigail noted it and filed it and moved on. The evening passed in the way evenings pass when the tension in a room has been named and partially released, not easily but honestly. People who hadn't spoken to Rhett in years spoke to him. Not all of them smoothly. Not all of them without awkwardness. But they spoke. And Rhett, to his credit, received it without either coldness or false warmth. Just the level, direct manner that was his nature, which people were apparently finding easier to read now that the story they'd been given about it had changed. Late in the evening after supper, and before the fiddler started up in earnest, Abigail found herself standing near the door alone for a moment, watching the room. She thought about the courthouse, about her mother's dress, and her father's averted eyes, and the ink on the paper, and the way she'd described it to herself as a wound, and then later corrected that description. She thought about the key in the lock on the inside of her door on the first night. She thought about a man who said he wasn't in the business of keeping people who didn't want to be kept, and then demonstrated over months that he'd meant it. Rhett appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him cross the room, but she'd learned his presence, the specific quality of it, and she felt it before he spoke. Ready to go, he said. Not yet, she said. A few more minutes. Ooh. He stood beside her without comment, which was the right thing to do, and which she was learning was how Rhett Callahan always operated. He found the right thing, and he did it quietly, without requiring acknowledgement. People keep looking at you, she said. They keep looking at us, he said. How does it feel? He considered. Unfamiliar, he said, but not bad. It'll become familiar, she said. Give it time. He looked at her sideways. You sound very certain about that. I am certain about that, she said. I'm certain about several things that I wasn't certain about 2 months ago. Such as... She kept her eyes on the room. Such as the fact that the worst circumstances don't always produce the worst outcomes. Sometimes they produce something else entirely. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Abigail. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that expression, the open one, the one without armor. And in the warm and noisy room around them, he said quietly, I know this wasn't what you chose, in the beginning. No, she said, it wasn't. And I know you stayed because of the fight, because of the case, because of the families. Those are some of the reasons, she said. What are the others? She looked at him. This man who kept every piece of paper for 17 years because his father told him to. Who put the key on the inside of the lock and meant it. Who knelt beside a dying calf at 2 in the morning and spoke to it in a low voice until it was calm. who rode to Denver in 2 days and came back with what they needed, who had been from the very first night at the kitchen table exactly what he said he was. "You," she said simply. "You're the other reason." The noise of the room continued around them. The fiddler tuned up somewhere in the back. People laughed and talked, and the ordinary, persistent business of living moved forward the way it always did. Rhett Callahan looked at his wife in the warm light of the Grange Hall, and something in his face completed itself, the way a thing looks when it has found the shape it was always meant to have. "I don't know how to do this," he said, the same words he'd said to her once before. But tonight, they meant something different, not an admission of limitation, a door opening. "Neither do I," she said. The same answer. But she was smiling when she said it, barely the contained smile of a woman who knows that not knowing is not the same as not being willing. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked back into the room together. Whitmore's criminal trial concluded the following spring, and he was convicted on 3 of the 4 counts. He lost his banking license. The properties fraudulently taken were subject to restitution orders that would take years to fully execute, but the orders existed, and existence was the first step. Judge Paris retired quietly at the end of his term and did not seek reappointment. Deputy Crane was elected to the full sheriff's position by a margin that surprised him and nobody else. The lending arrangement Abigail proposed was set up formally in January under the name Callahan Valley Credit, which she had not chosen, but which Tom Henderson had put on the paperwork, and which she admitted was probably better than what she would have called it. 7 families participated in the first year, 12 in the second. Gerald Whitaker came in April, when the weather eased and stayed a week. He was older than she remembered and more humble. And on the second day, he sat at the kitchen table across from Rhett and said haltingly something that Abigail suspected had cost him more than most things he'd ever done. She gave them privacy for that conversation. She didn't need to hear it. What she knew was that after it, her father spent 2 hours helping Rhett repair a section of the barn roof that had been soft for a season, and they worked side by side in the particular companionable silence of men who have resolved something between them and are now moving forward. She watched them from below and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled so long she'd forgotten what settled felt like. Hector Gaines, who had seen everything and commented selectively, found her there watching. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. "You know what I think," he said finally. "What?" she said. "I think you were always going to end up somewhere like this," he said. "Doing something like this. The ranch just happened to be in the way." She considered that. "That's a very Hector thing to say." "I'm a very Hector kind of person," he agreed and went back to work. That night, after her father had gone to his room and the ranch had settled into its nighttime quiet, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and the correspondence box, and the accumulated weight of a life that had, without asking permission, become something she recognized as entirely her own. Rhett came in from the last check of the livestock and hung his coat and poured coffee and sat across from her, and the candle between them was the same as always, burning down to where it always burned, and the table between them was the same table, and none of it was the same at all. "The Mora family's first repayment came in," she said. "I know, Hector told me." He looked at her. "You should sleep." "I will," she said. "I'm almost done." He waited. She closed the ledger. She looked up at him. "Rhett," she said. "The key," she said. "On the inside of the door, that first night." He looked at her carefully. "What about it?" "I stopped locking it," she said. "Somewhere around the 3rd week. I never mentioned it." He held her gaze. "I know," he said quietly. "I noticed." The candle burned between them. "I just wanted you to know that I noticed too," she said. "That it mattered. That all of it mattered from that first night forward." He looked at her for a long moment in the way that meant a man was arriving at something true. Then he said very simply, "It mattered to me too, every day of it." She reached across the table, her hand on his, not dramatic, not careful, just there. He turned his hand and held hers. Outside, the Colorado night was cold and clear and full of stars. And inside the Callahan Ranch kitchen, two people who had found each other through the wreckage of someone else's scheme sat together in the quiet and understood without needing to say it further that what they'd built here was not the life either of them had been given. It was the life they had chosen for themselves on their own terms, with clear eyes and full knowledge of who the other person was. That was not luck. That was not rescue. Love that stories sometimes told about. That was the real thing. And it was built to last.